Okay, hey guys, and welcome to Intro to the Interpreting Profession. I am your host, Lael Hudson. I'm going to be doing my videos in both English and then in sign language. I'm going to be interpreting for myself. These videos that you're going to see in succession are going to be related to the Code of Professional Conduct. We do this the first week in part so that you have time to go get your book. But we also do it the first week because honestly it's one of the most foundational things that you're going to have to know for the rest of your interpreting career. It's not just something you have to study for the test, although it is important to know for the national exam, but it's just something that you're going to need to know for basic everyday situations you encounter in the interpreting field. So this first video that I wanted to make is going to go over the beginning of the Code of Professional Conduct prior to the tenets. It's important that you really read over this document for yourself, but I wanted to make these videos to kind of highlight a few important parts of the Code of Professional Conduct that I think you really need to see. So if you look at it, and there is a link to the Code of Professional Conduct on the website, on the Angel webpage, but you'll first see that it talks about the scope of the Code of Professional Conduct, the philosophy, and some other information. It's important to note first of all that the reason we have this Code of Professional Conduct, we used to just have 7 tenets called the Code of Ethics, and that was what we abided by. And it was stuff like, be professional. Okay, what the heck does that mean? After many, many years, interpreters realized, you know, we need something that explains more of what these tenets are talking about than just to have this small little sentence that says, do this. And so the RID, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, as well as the National Association of the Deaf, the NAD, used to have their own testing systems, and they decided to go ahead and come together to make one national testing system. And in the process of doing that, they decided to also come up with one set of tenets for interpreters to follow. And so these two organizations got together and really spent time looking over all of the Code of Ethics to try to find some examples to give with each tenet to show how you should be following each one. One of the things that I like to go over in the beginning of this is, let's see, it gives some very general information. If you go on to page 2 where it starts talking about applicability, I'd like to note that under A of applicability it says, the Code of Professional Conduct applies to certified and associate members of the RID, certified members of the NAD. Okay, so that doesn't apply to you yet. However, it says also interns and students of the profession. Very often I have students come up to me and they'll be telling me the names of people they've worked with, all kinds of things, and they're like, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm just a student. Yes, it does! Just because you're a student does not mean you're exempt from following this. And so henceforth I feel like if this applies to you, you should know what it says. So that's one reason we go over it. Also, something that you need to keep in the back of your mind as we go through each tenet is that under B it says federal, state, or other statutes or regulations may supersede this CPC. We condense it to the CPC. When there is a conflict between this code and local, state, or federal laws and regulations, the interpreter obeys the rule of the law. So, always remember that no matter what this document says, if there's a law that supersedes it, it supersedes it. It's always going to beat out the Code of Professional Conduct. Okay? And then under C it says, this Code of Professional Conduct applies to interpreted situations that are performed either face-to-face or remotely. And so it doesn't matter how you're interpreting it. It doesn't matter if you're doing it over a video, if you're doing it volunteer for that matter, any of those things, it doesn't matter. The CPC still applies to you. So I think that's very important for you to recognize as you go through, even as a student, just so you know what the rules of the game are. That's what we're going to refer to this as, is the rules of the game. Also, I like to look under definitions, because some of the way that the CPC defines the players of the game are different than how I would necessarily think of them in person. So we want to make sure that we understand how this document is referring to things. One of those definitions, one of the main ones that differs, is colleagues. As far as this document goes, the only people who are your colleagues are other interpreters, okay? So, for example, when I was working full-time as an interpreter for a college, I would have considered any of the administrators, any of the faculty, anyone, you know, from the custodial staff, anybody there to have been my colleague, because that was my place of work, and so henceforth I felt like anyone I was working with would have been my colleague. That's true. However, for the purposes of this document, that wouldn't be true. Anyone who I worked with, aside from another interpreter, would have been considered my consumer. So, henceforth, if I would have been interpreting in a biology class, the biology teacher would have been my consumer, as well as the student would have been my consumer. Okay? So that's important to note. Whenever we're talking about colleagues, as far as this document is concerned, it's just your other interpreters, or like your team interpreter. So if I had had a team interpreter in that biology class, they would have been considered my colleague. Okay? Also a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest between the private interests, personal, financial, or professional, and the other, or official or professional responsibilities of an interpreter in a position of trust, whether actual or perceived, deriving from a specific interpreting situation. So it's important to note that a conflict of interest doesn't just have to be something that actually is a conflict of interest. It can be something that's perceived as a conflict of interest, and we'll get into that more under some of the tenets later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. And then we've kind of already touched on this, but again, consumers relate to individuals and entities who are a part of the interpreted situation. This includes individuals who are deaf, deafblind, hard of hearing, and, oh yes, hearing, okay? It also doesn't matter who's paying for the services. Your clients or consumers are anybody who are in the interpreted situation. Anybody who's listening to the interpretation, anybody who you're actually interpreting for, whether it be to voice or to sign for, any of that, those are considered your consumers or clients, okay? Anyway, that wraps it up as far as the beginning of the Code of Professional Conduct. Now we're going to start to delve into the specific tenets to give you some explanation as to what each one means. Okay? Enjoy your reading.